I'm delighted to be back in Berlin, Germany's capital, for yet another visit. Still, this time of gathering marks the 25th anniversary of an event of colossal importance, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, our generation, dear friends, probably remembers three dates. The first, if you are old enough, John Kennedy's assassination. Where were you this day? The second is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the third is the 11th September. And these days, you probably, as a person and mostly as a politician, you always remember. 95 miles of wall and death strip, plus minefields and 300 watchtowers marked the more than visible to the naked eye division. The division not only of Berlin, but of Europe and the world. 136 people have died trying to cross it until the voice of the German people, Wir sind ein Volk, tore it down in 1989. Until then, this great city was divided. Europe was divided. And the world became bipolar and in danger of annihilation by any or both of the two superpowers. Never before this city, but also Europe and the world itself, have been so visibly separated politically as in the 45 years that elapsed between the end of the war and the wall's demolition. The tragedy of separation and a Western refusal to accept it as permanent was marked by two pleas from American leaders, John Kennedy in 1963 with his cry, Ich bin ein Berliner, and Ronald Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate in 1987 with his Mr. Gorbachev, turn down this wall. These two pleas earmarked the fact that for the Western democracies, this division was unacceptable, and that its end, and nothing less than its end, was their desideratum. May I also add a third point? In 1985, Helmut Kohl invited at the time all the leaders of the Christian democratic parties in front of the Brandenburger Tor. I was a young girl at the time, but I was there, and heard Helmut Kohl say that this wall will come down. And I must admit that at the time, I looked at him and said, this man has high hopes. Is it possible that through my life, I would see this happen? Well, it only took 5 years later than that date, and the wall was demolished. Ladies and gentlemen, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War led to several successive developments at the German, European, and world level. It gave rise to the United States emerging uncontestably, at least until 2001, as the world's sole superpower. It was heralded in the West as the end of communism and the very victory of capitalism and liberalism. And Francis Fukuyama, in his celebrated article, called the moment the end of history. Germany itself went down the painful path of an essential, that is not just political, but also social, economic unification, and it rededicated itself forcefully to European integration and the establishment of the European Union in 1992. 25 years later, Potsdamer Platz is a wasteland no more. It is surrounded by gleaming offices. Friedrichstraße is lined with expensive boutiques, but many of the economic and social problems of the German separation still need to be faced. Germany has, in the meantime, without this having been designed by her, become Europe's disproportionately larger power engine, and its GDP represents 27% of the European Union total. The formerly communist countries of East Europe started the long but most fruitful course towards European integration. Some have flourished, like the Czech Republic and Poland. Others, like Bulgaria and Romania, still struggle to adapt. The US, since 2001, embarked in a series of foreign adventures that have weakened the world's perception of it as the sole superpower, and Russia, anti-clockwise, has started to emerge not only as a confident player in the world stage, but as a rather overconfident actor in East Europe, the Caucasus, and beyond, an actor whose political aims, and above all the methods for achieving them, raise serious concerns. Ladies and gentlemen, the question was asked of us today, is there a danger of new walls in Europe? I'm very much afraid that the question is gravely belated. New walls have already been erected in Europe. Their consequences are strongly felt, and this is the worst part of it. Europe seems, on the whole, unable to stand up to the challenges they pose. Let us see them in some detail. The euphoria of the transition following the reunification of Europe is now blackened by the suffering of peoples like the Greeks and the Portuguese following the debt crisis in the Eurozone. The Eurozone crisis itself has demonstrated a fundamental weakness of the Eurozone itself, that it has proceeded to a fiscal and monetary union without completing an economic union. The medicine chosen for the therapy of the problems of the debt-stricken countries has had grave social and economic consequences. In my country, Greece, for example, a fourth of the total GDP was lost. Unemployment rose from 9 to 27%. 60% of the age group between 18 and 24 years old are currently unemployed. Bank deposits fell from roughly 220 billion euros to 163. There is a continent-wide rise of extremist and Europhobic political forces, particularly of the far right. And this is not a phenomenon restricted to the debt-ridden countries. It appears in Holland, it appears in Austria, Hungary, and Scandinavia. The old EU is separated now more than ever by new dividing lines that raise serious concerns about its economic and, above all, its psychological unity. The North-South divide, the center-periphery divide, and even, and we must admit it, the loosening of the Franco-German core with the economic weakening of France and the parallel rise of Germany as almost the sole economic hyper-engine of the Union. Likewise, in the new European Union, we have the new rich and poor among the countries of the old communist bloc. British aloofness and isolationism as terrified by the rise of the Independence Party. The halt to new enlargements and the persisting precarious situation in the Western Balkans. Albanian irredentism, firm historic revisionism and provocations against its southern neighbor, the stalemate in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the issue of Kosovo, the Albanian-Serb hostility, they all show that by putting the problems under the carpet, we do not solve them, we just aggravate them. Worst of all, dear friends, is what I have described in a lecture of mine elsewhere, and with your permission I will repeat it here. I call it the dual loss of legitimacy problem. And by this I mean the disturbing Europe-wide development whereby the European peoples all over the Union lost faith both in the nation state, seeing it unable to face the many problems exceeding its competencies, and in the European Union, seeing that it is also unable to face problems both internally and externally. Ladies and gentlemen, as Europeans, we are also obliged to remember our immediate neighborhood. And what happens in our neighborhood is something no less than tragic. Prime Minister Zapatero already mentioned it. The Mediterranean Union, Massimo D'Alema is here, for which we worked so hard to bring about, was practically collapsed following the negative turn of events after the Arab Spring in several of the southern Mediterranean countries. The Middle East, particularly Syria, is developing into the most massive human catastrophe since World War II. In the Caucasus and in Transnistria, we have nothing less than frozen conflicts. In the East, we face the great problem of the Ukraine and the new Russian assertiveness. Last but not least, Turkey is again completely out of the lawful track, and her policies are reversed to the worst behavior possible. Complete disregard of European and international law. At the moment of speaking, her warships, as you always heard by my friend Erato, are deep inside a member state, Cyprus, exclusive economic zone. Threats of annexing the northern part of Cyprus are voiced by no less a person than the Turkish president, and we should never forget that Turkey continues to occupy 37% of an EU member state's territory. Hearing about these outrageous facts, some, of course, will say that they have become tiring, that the Greeks keep telling us about Turkey and so on. Let me just remind you that we Greeks are very, very strong supporters of Turkey's European Union participation. We strongly believe that if Turkey really accepts the European acquis communautaire, then all the problems in the region will be solved. This is why we even today persist in supporting Turkish European path, but unfortunately, I'm afraid the Turks themselves are not sure about it anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, in facing these grave problems in and around the European Union, we need to follow the ancient and wise Chinese advice. Fix your house first if you want to fix your neighbors. We must see to it that we fix the issues of any persisting democratic deficit within the Union. This need not to be done by altering the treaties. We should institute an essential Eurozone governance, alleviate the problems of poverty and introduce development strategies for the entire European Union, particularly the debt-stricken and other poorer member states. We must rediscover the Western Balkans, see that they do not explode again, and reopen to them the European perspective. Turkey must be called upon to choose whether it will be inside or outside international legality. If the choice is the former, we must see how we can bring it closer to Europe. And if it's the latter, we must see that it will face consequences. Exactly the same can, in the current situation, be said about Russia. We must reorganize and revise the Mediterranean Union policies to stand up to the new developments since the Arab Spring. In collaboration with the United States, we need an all-encompassing new Middle East policy, reaching far beyond dealing with the immediate consequence of the virus crisis. And last but not least, Prime Minister Zapatero is right. We must never allow the political differences in the Middle East to become a religious war. This would be fatal. We must understand that what ISIS today represents is not Islam and it's not a state. It's just a terrorist group acting on its own interest. And let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, by finishing here, that Prophet Muhammad was the man who put the monastery of St. Catherine's in the Sinai mountain under his protection. And if this monastery still exists 2,000 years later, it's because some Muslim nomads are taking care of it. So I think this is the best answer to whoever wants, by a bad interpretation of the Quran, trying to make a new division to the world, and this division made it a religious one. Ladies and gentlemen, we strongly believed when we were younger that this Berlin Wall will come down. It is our generation who must make sure that new dividing lines, like the wall in Nicosia, will also not stay longer than it has to. Thank you very much.